The day my husband left me at the airport was the day I stopped begging someone to choose me. I was standing at JFK Airport at 5:20 in the morning, holding 2 tickets to Paris. 2 tickets I bought for our 7th wedding anniversary. 2 tickets I thought would save my marriage. I thought this trip would bring us back to the way we used to be. I thought maybe we were just tired, maybe we were just lost, maybe we just needed a few days away from everything, but I was wrong, because only one of us was getting on that plane, and it wasn't my husband, Claire. I turned around. Ethan was standing behind me, the man I had loved for 7 years, the man I built my entire life around. His face looked calm. Too calm. There was no sadness, no regret, no sign that he was about to break my heart. Then he said the words I never expected to hear: "I can't go with you." For a moment I thought I misunderstood him. What? My company needs me here. I stared at him. I looked at the suitcase in my hand. Then I looked at the 2 tickets. "Ethan, today is our anniversary, I know." "Then why are you doing this?" He looked away. "Claire, don't make this harder than it already is." That sentence, those exact words, they told me everything, because for the past year, every time I tried to talk about our marriage, he said the same thing. Don't make things difficult. Don't overthink. Don't be emotional. But the truth was, I wasn't making things difficult. I was the only person trying to save what was already falling apart. I looked at Ethan one last time, and I asked him a question. A question I already knew the answer to. Is there someone else? For a second his expression changed, just for a second, but it was enough. Because sometimes people don't need to confess, their silence does it for them. He didn't answer, and that was my answer. I picked up my suitcase. I didn't scream, I didn't cry, I didn't ask him to stay, because at that moment something inside me finally changed. For 7 years I was afraid of losing Ethan, but standing in that airport, I realized I was more afraid of losing myself. My name is Claire Wilson, I'm 29 years old. And if you had met me 5 years earlier, you probably would have thought I had the perfect life. I was married to Ethan Miller. He was handsome, successful, ambitious. He worked as a senior executive at one of the biggest investment companies in New York. Everyone admired him. People saw a confident man who knew exactly what he wanted. And they saw me as the lucky woman beside him. Whenever we went to dinner with friends, people would smile and say, "You two are the perfect couple. He's going to be very successful. You must be so proud of him." And I always smiled, because I was proud of him. I really was. The problem was, I was slowly disappearing while helping him become everything he wanted to be. People only saw the version of Ethan outside our home. They saw the expensive suits, the successful career, the confidence. They didn't see the man who came home at midnight and forgot I was waiting. They didn't see the empty conversations. They didn't see how two people could sleep in the same bed and still feel completely alone. But before Ethan became that person, he was different. I met him during my senior year of college. It was a cold afternoon in New York. I was rushing into a small coffee shop near campus because I was late for class. I had too many books in my hands. I wasn't paying attention, and then I bumped into someone. My coffee spilled all over his coat. I froze. "Oh my God, I'm so sorry." I was already preparing for him to get angry. But he just looked at his coat, then he looked at me, and smiled. "You know," he said, "most people just say hello." I laughed, and somehow that was the beginning of everything. Back then, Ethan made me feel special. He remembered the smallest things about me. He knew I hated overly sweet coffee. He knew I loved rainy days. He knew I got nervous before presentations. Whenever I doubted myself, he would look at me and say, "Claire, you don't have to be perfect. You are already enough." Those words meant everything to me, because when you truly love someone, you believe them. After college, we stayed in New York together. We didn't have much money. We lived in a tiny apartment with old furniture and a kitchen so small that we had to move around each other while cooking. But honestly, those were the happiest years of my life. We weren't rich. We weren't successful, but we were happy. We would cook dinner together. We would watch movies on the floor. We would talk about our future until 2 in the morning. Ethan used to hold my hand and say, "One day I'll buy you a house near the ocean. We'll wake up every morning and watch the sunrise." At that time, I didn't care about the house. I didn't care about money. I only cared that he was there. I thought that was enough. Then everything changed. Ethan started working in finance. At first, I was excited. I watched him work hard. I watched him chase his goals, and I wanted him to succeed. I was his biggest supporter. When he got his first major promotion, I celebrated more than anyone. When he closed his first big deal, I opened a bottle of champagne. When everyone believed in him, I was the person who believed in him before anyone else, but slowly success changed him. At first it was small things. He started coming home later. He started missing dinner. He started canceling plans, and every time I made excuses, he's just busy. He's building our future. This is temporary. I kept telling myself that. Because admitting the truth meant accepting something painful, the man I loved was becoming someone I no longer recognized. And I wasn't ready to admit that. Not yet. Ethan's career continued to grow, and my place in his life slowly became smaller. At first I didn't notice. Or maybe I noticed, but I didn't want to admit it. Because when you love someone, you don't immediately accept that they are changing. You look for excuses. You protect the person you love, even when they are the reason you are hurting. Ethan started coming home after midnight more often. Sometimes I would fall asleep waiting for him. Sometimes I would wake up and see him sitting on the edge of the bed, answering emails at 3 in the morning. I wanted to understand, I really did. I told myself he is working hard because he wants us to have a better life. But the problem was, I was always waiting for that better life to begin. And somehow it never came. One night I prepared dinner for us, nothing special, just his favorite pasta, the same recipe I made when we were dating. I lit a few candles. I even opened a bottle of wine because I wanted one normal night. One night where we could just be us again. But Ethan didn't come home at 7 or 8 or 9. He came home after midnight, the food was cold, the candles had already burned out, and I was sitting alone at the table. When he walked in, he looked surprised. "Claire? Why are you still awake?" I looked at him. "I was waiting for you." He took off his coat. "I'm sorry, work was crazy." I nodded. "I know." But the truth was, I was tired of always understanding. I was tired of always being the patient one. I was tired of pretending that being ignored didn't hurt. "Ethan," he stopped. "What?" I looked at him. "Do you think we're okay?" His expression changed. Not because he was worried, because he looked annoyed. "What kind of question is that?" "A real one." I stood up. "I feel like we're not close anymore. We barely talk. You don't ask about my day. You don't even notice when something is wrong." He sighed. And that sigh hurt, because it made me feel like my feelings were a problem. "Claire, I'm exhausted." "I know." "Then why are we doing this right now?" I looked at him. "Because I miss my husband." For a moment, he didn't say anything. Then he looked away. "I don't have time for this." That sentence stayed with me. Not because it was cruel, because it showed me something. I wasn't asking for too much. I was asking the wrong person that night. I cried quietly, not because we had a fight, but because I realized I was fighting alone. After that, things became even colder. Ethan started protecting his phone. Before, it was always on the table. Now it was always in his hand. He added a password. He took it with him everywhere. Even when he went to shower. I noticed. Of course I noticed. But I kept telling myself not to think the worst. Because sometimes the truth is so painful that people choose doubt instead. I chose doubt, until the night I found out. It was a Thursday evening. Ethan came home late again. He walked into the bedroom and placed his jacket on the chair. I picked it up to hang it in the closet, and then I smelled something. A perfume. Not mine. A woman's perfume. A sweet floral scent that I didn't recognize. I stood there holding his jacket. My first reaction wasn't anger. It was fear. Because deep down I already knew. But I still wanted him to prove me wrong. When Ethan came out of the bathroom, I asked, "Who were you with tonight?" He looked confused. "What? Who were you with?" He stared at me, then he laughed. Not because something was funny, because he was uncomfortable. "Claire, seriously?" I felt my heart sink. "What does that mean?" "It means you're acting strange." "I'm asking you a question, and I'm telling you there's nothing to worry about." I looked at him. "Then why do I feel like you're hiding something?" His face became colder. "Do you hear yourself?" "What?" "You're becoming paranoid." That word hurt, paranoid. For a second, I actually questioned myself. Maybe I was wrong. Maybe I was being too sensitive. Maybe I was the problem? And that was the worst part. Not just that he might be lying, but that he made me doubt my own feelings. That night, after Ethan fell asleep, I sat on the edge of the bed. I looked at him. The same man who once promised to love me forever. And I wondered when exactly I lost him. Was it when he became successful? Was it when he met new people? Or was it slowly happening while I was too busy trying to keep everything together? A few weeks later, Ethan surprised me. He came home early. He brought flowers. And he smiled. A smile I hadn't seen in a long time. "Claire," I looked up. "What?" "I have something planned." I was surprised. "What is it?" He walked closer. "Let's go to Paris." I froze. "Paris?" "Yes."
Just you and me.
He smiled. "I think we need to reconnect for the first time in months." I felt hope. Maybe this was it. Maybe he finally realized we were losing each other. Maybe he finally wanted to fix things. I started planning immediately. I bought new clothes. I booked restaurants. I searched for places we could visit. I started imagining us walking through Paris like we did when we first fell in love. I didn't know it then, but Ethan wasn't planning a trip to save our marriage. He was planning the moment he would leave it. The night before our flight, everything changed. Ethan was in the shower. His phone was on the nightstand. The screen suddenly lit up. I wasn't trying to look. I promise I wasn't. But then I saw the name, Sophia Anderson. The woman Ethan always described as nothing more than a business partner. And the message on the screen said, "Tomorrow after she leaves, everything will finally be ours." I froze. For a few seconds I couldn't move. I just stared at the message on Ethan's phone. "Tomorrow after she leaves, everything will finally be ours." I read it again, then again. But the words didn't change. My hands started shaking. My heart was racing, but somehow I didn't cry. I think there are moments in life when the truth hurts so much that your body doesn't know how to react. You don't scream. You don't fight. You just become quiet. Because somewhere deep inside you already knew, you were just waiting for proof. I picked up his phone, and for the first time in 7 years, I allowed myself to see the truth. I opened the conversation. At first, I wasn't looking for evidence. I was looking for a reason to forgive him. A reason to believe there was still something I didn't understand, but instead I found a completely different life. A life Ethan had been living without me. Sophia Anderson, the woman he always called his business partner. The woman he told me not to worry about. The woman he said was just a friend. They had been talking for almost a year. At first their messages were about work, meetings, projects, investments, normal conversations. But slowly the messages changed. They started talking about feelings. They started talking about spending time together. They started talking about a future where I didn't exist. I kept scrolling. Every message felt like another piece of my marriage breaking apart. Then I saw a message from Sophia. "Are you really going to leave her?" A few minutes later, Ethan replied, "I should have done it sooner." I stared at that sentence, because that was the moment I understood. This wasn't something that just happened. This wasn't one mistake. This wasn't an accident. He had been making a choice every day for almost a year. Then I saw another message. Sophia wrote, "Do you think Claire knows?" Ethan replied, "No, Claire trusts me too much." That sentence hurt more than anything else. Not because he was with someone else, but because he knew exactly why I wouldn't suspect him. He knew I loved him. He knew I believed him. He knew I would defend him even when everyone else questioned him. And he used that love against me. I slowly put the phone back where I found it. Then I sat on the edge of the bed. The shower was still running. Ethan was only a few feet away. The same room, the same house, the same person. But suddenly, everything felt unfamiliar. I looked around, the wedding photos on the wall, the pictures from our vacations, the memories we created together. And I started asking myself a question. How long had I been the only person still fighting for this marriage? A few minutes later, Ethan walked out of the bathroom. He was drying his hair with a towel. The moment he saw me, he knew something was wrong. Maybe it was my face. Maybe it was the silence. Or maybe it was because, for the first time, I wasn't looking at him like the man I loved. I was looking at him like a stranger. "Claire?" I didn't answer. His eyes moved toward the nightstand. Then back to me. And I saw it. Fear. Real fear. "Did you see my phone?" I looked at him. Then I asked quietly, "Who is Sophia?" His expression changed immediately, just for a second. But that second was enough, because I already knew. "Claire, listen to me." I smiled, a small, painful smile. I have been listening to you for 7 years. You told me everything was fine. You told me I was overthinking. You told me I was imagining things. I stood up, but the whole time you were the one hiding the truth. He took a step toward me. It's not what you think. I looked at him. Then tell me what it is. He opened his mouth. But nothing came out, because there was no explanation that could erase what I had seen. Claire, I can't explain. I shook my head. No, you can explain why you did it, but you can't explain why you made me feel like I was crazy for noticing something was wrong. The room became silent. A few months earlier, that silence would have terrified me. I would have cried. I would have begged. I would have asked what I needed to change, but that night something inside me was different. I was tired. Not angry. Not even surprised, just tired. Are you in love with her? Ethan looked down. He didn't answer immediately. And that pause told me everything. I closed my eyes, because sometimes the answer you fear the most is the answer you already know. Okay. That was all I said, just one word. Okay, because I finally understood something. I couldn't force someone to choose me. I couldn't love someone into loving me back. The next morning, I woke up before Ethan. I made coffee. I packed my suitcase. I acted like everything was normal, and I think that scared him more than anger would have. He expected a fight. He expected tears. He expected me to ask him to stay, but I didn't. Because for years I was afraid of losing Ethan. That morning, I became afraid of losing myself. When we arrived at the airport, I already knew what was coming. I knew he had made his choice. I knew his heart was somewhere else. But I still wanted to hear him say it, and he did. Claire, I can't go with you. I looked at him. The man who once promised me forever. The man who once told me I was the most important person in his life. And I asked him one final question. Ethan, are you sure? He looked confused. What? I smiled. Nothing. Then I picked up my suitcase and I walked away. I didn't run. I didn't look back. Because for the first time in 7 years, I wasn't walking away because I stopped loving him. I was walking away because I finally chose myself. After leaving the airport, I didn't go home. I couldn't. That apartment no longer felt like my home. Every corner carried memories. The kitchen where we cooked together. The couch where we watched movies late at night. The bedroom where we promised we would love each other forever. Everything around me reminded me of a life that no longer existed. So I drove. I didn't know where I was going. I just knew I couldn't stay there. After almost an hour, I found myself in front of a small coffee shop in Manhattan, a place I hadn't visited in years. The same coffee shop where Ethan and I first met. I walked inside. The smell of coffee filled the room. People were talking quietly. Someone was typing on a laptop near the window. Everything looked almost exactly the same, except me. 7 years ago, I sat in that coffee shop as a young woman who believed she had found the person she would spend her life with. That morning, I sat there as a woman who had to learn how to live without him. I ordered a coffee and sat by the window. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't waiting for anyone. My phone started ringing. I looked down. It was Ethan. I watched his name appear on the screen. A year ago, I would have answered immediately. I would have worried. I would have wondered if he needed me. But now, I just watched it stop ringing. A few seconds later, he sent me a message. Where are you? I stared at those 3 words. Not, are you okay? Not, I'm sorry. Not, please come back. Just, where are you? And somehow that told me everything, even after losing me. He was still thinking about where I was, not how much he hurt me, not what I was feeling, just where I was. I put my phone away. I took a sip of coffee, and for the first time in months, I felt peaceful. Not happy, not healed, but peaceful, because I finally stopped fighting for someone who had already chosen to leave. That night, I stayed at a small hotel. I didn't go back to the apartment. I didn't call Ethan. I didn't ask for an explanation. I just sat by the window and watched the city lights. And I asked myself a question I hadn't asked in years. Who was Claire before she became Ethan's wife? The answer shocked me, because I realized I didn't know anymore. For 7 years, my entire life had been built around another person. I planned my days around his schedule. I changed my plans because of his career. I supported his dreams. I celebrated his victories. But somewhere along the way, I stopped thinking about my own before Ethan. I wasn't just a woman waiting for someone to love her. I had dreams, I had goals, I had built something. Something Ethan never knew about. The next morning, I opened an old email account. I hadn't checked it in years. Honestly, I wasn't even sure why I opened it. Maybe some part of me knew I needed to remember who I used to be. There were hundreds of old messages. Most of them were useless. Old newsletters, old business emails, old notifications. Then I saw a name I hadn't seen in years, William Carter. I stopped for a moment. William was not just an old friend. He was the person who believed in me before anyone else did. I opened his email. It was sent 7 years ago. The subject line was simple. Whenever you're ready. The message only had a few sentences. Claire, I don't know what life looks like for you now, but if you ever decide to come back, your place is still waiting for you. I read that message several times, and for the first time since the airport, I felt something different. Not sadness, not anger, hope. Because maybe losing Ethan didn't mean losing everything. Maybe it meant finding the parts of myself I had abandoned. Before I met Ethan, I was a different person. During my final year of college, I started a technology company with 3 friends. We were young, we had no money, no powerful connections, no famous investors, just an idea, and a lot of determination. Most people didn't believe in us. They saw 4 college students trying to build something impossible. One investor even told us, "You have passion, but passion doesn't create a successful company." At the time, those words hurt, but they also motivated me, because I knew something. Everyone who builds something meaningful starts as someone nobody believes in. So we kept working. We stayed up late. We made mistakes. We failed. We tried again. Then William found us, unlike everyone else. He didn't ask how young we were. He didn't ask who supported us. He asked one question. "Do you believe this idea can change something?" I said yes. And he believed me. William became our first major investor. With his support, our company started growing. Slowly at first, then faster than we ever imagined. Within a few years, the small company we created in a college apartment became a successful technology business. Eventually, a larger company acquired it. My shares became worth millions. I had built a future with my own hands. But then I met Ethan, and I made a choice. I stepped away. I sold most of my shares. I kept enough investments to protect myself. Then I disappeared from that world. Why? Because I wanted something simple. I wanted to know if someone could love me without knowing my success, without knowing my money, without knowing what I had achieved. I wanted to know if Ethan loved Claire, or if he loved what Claire could provide. And for a long time I believed he loved me. But now I understood something. Sometimes people don't leave because you weren't enough. Sometimes they leave because they never truly understood your value. The next morning, I called William. My hand was shaking before I pressed the button. 7 years. That was how long it had been since I walked away from my old life. When he answered, there was a moment of silence. Then he said, "Claire?" I smiled. "Hi, William." He laughed softly. "I was wondering when I would hear from you again." I looked out the window. The city was waking up. People were starting their days, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was starting mine. "I think I'm ready," I said. And this time, I wasn't talking about going back to a company. I was talking about coming back to myself. 3 days later, I walked into Carter Technologies again, but this time I wasn't walking in as the woman who left 7 years ago. I wasn't the young founder who had no idea what the future would look like. I wasn't Ethan's wife. I was Claire Wilson. And for the first time in years, I felt like I was exactly where I was supposed to be. The building was much bigger than I remembered. Glass walls, modern offices, hundreds of employees working on different projects. People were moving quickly, discussing ideas, solving problems, and somehow seeing all of this made me emotional. Because I remembered where it started. A small apartment, a cheap desk, 4 young people who had no idea if their dream would ever work. And now, that dream was real. William was waiting for me near the entrance. When he saw me, he smiled. "You know, I wasn't sure you would actually come." I laughed. "Neither was I." He shook his head. "That sounds like the old Claire." I looked at him. "What do you mean?" "The Claire I knew always believed in herself. She just forgot for a while." His words stayed with me, because he was right. I didn't lose my ability. I didn't lose my intelligence. I didn't lose my ambition. I just spent too many years convincing myself that someone else's dream mattered more than mine. William walked me through the company. People greeted him. They talked about upcoming projects. They asked for his opinions. Then something happened that surprised me. Several employees recognized me. Is that Claire Wilson? I thought she left the industry years ago. She was one of the original founders, right? I smiled politely. But inside, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. I felt seen, not because I was someone's wife, not because I was standing next to someone successful, because of something I created. Later that afternoon, William showed me the company's current projects. The business had grown, but he also showed me the challenges. One competitor had become a serious threat, a company that was expanding aggressively, Miller Capital Ventures. I stared at the screen, and my expression changed because I knew that name. Ethan. William noticed immediately. You know this company? I stayed silent for a moment. Then I answered, yes. How? I looked at the documents. Because the CEO is my husband. William looked surprised. Ethan? I nodded. Or at least? I paused. My soon-to-be ex-husband. William didn't say anything for a few seconds. Then he looked at me carefully. Are you okay? I smiled. I thought I would feel something, but I don't, and that was the truth. A few months ago, seeing Ethan's name would have destroyed me. Now it was just a name, a person from my past, someone I once loved. But no longer someone who controlled my emotions. William nodded. That means you're healing. Maybe he was right, because I finally understood something. Moving on doesn't mean forgetting someone existed. It means their existence no longer decides your happiness. Meanwhile, Ethan had no idea what was happening. He was still trying to fix the damage inside his company. After I left, he thought everything would return to normal. He thought I would eventually forgive him, because for years that was what happened. Whenever he made a mistake, I was the person who stayed. Whenever things got difficult, I was the person who supported him. But this time was different. This time there was no message from me, no phone call, no apology, no attempt to save him. And slowly, Ethan started realizing something. I was really gone. At first, he refused to accept it. He told himself I just needed time. But then he saw the news, an interview with William Carter, a discussion about the future of Carter Technologies, and standing beside William was me, Claire Wilson, the woman he thought he knew. The woman he thought was living a simple life. The woman he believed needed him. Ethan watched the interview several times. He couldn't believe it. The woman on the screen looked confident, calm, powerful. Nothing like the person he imagined. Then he remembered something all those years ago when he came home stressed from work. I always knew exactly what questions to ask when he struggled with business decisions. I always gave him advice that helped. When he was nervous before important meetings, I was the person who calmed him down. Back then he thought I was just being supportive. Now he realized I understood because I had been there before. I wasn't standing behind him. I was standing beside him. He just never noticed. That night, Ethan sat alone in his apartment. The same apartment where he thought he had finally gained freedom. But it didn't feel like freedom anymore. It felt empty. Sophia walked in. She looked at him. You saw the interview? Ethan looked up. Yes, she smiled. So now you know. He frowned. Know what? That Claire was never who you thought she was. Ethan stayed silent. Sophia sat down. You always talked about wanting a powerful partner, someone who understood your world, and you already had one. Ethan looked at her. What are you saying? Sophia looked away. I'm saying you spent years searching for something you already had. Those words hit him harder than he expected, because they were true. He didn't leave Claire because she wasn't enough. He left because he failed to see enough. A few days later, Ethan made a decision. He needed to talk to Claire, not because he wanted her money, not because he needed her help, but because for the first time he wanted to face the person he had hurt. He walked into Carter Technologies, and when he saw Claire standing there, he realized something. The woman he abandoned at the airport was never the woman who needed him. She was the woman who chose him, and he had been too blind to understand the difference. The next morning, Ethan arrived at Carter Technologies earlier than expected. For the first time in years, he wasn't walking into a room full of people who wanted something from him. He wasn't there as a CEO. He wasn't there as a businessman. He was there as a man who needed to admit he was wrong. When the receptionist told Claire that Ethan was waiting, She wasn't surprised. Somewhere inside, she knew this moment would come. She walked into the meeting room. Ethan was standing near the window. For a few seconds, neither of them spoke. The silence between them felt completely different from the silence they used to have at home. Before, silence meant distance. Now, silence meant they both understood the weight of what happened. Claire. She looked at him. Ethan. He took a deep breath. I know I don't have the right to ask for your time. Claire didn't answer, but I wanted to talk to you. About what? He looked down. About everything. Claire sat across from him. Okay. Ethan looked at her, and that simple word surprised him because the old Claire would have been emotional. She would have wanted answers. She would have wanted him to explain every detail. But this Claire was different. Calm, controlled, strong. I saw the interview. Claire nodded. I know. I didn't know. She looked at him. Didn't know what? Who you really were? For a moment, Claire said nothing. Then she smiled slightly. Ethan, I didn't become someone new. I was always this person. Those words hit him, because they were true. She didn't suddenly become successful after leaving him. She didn't suddenly become intelligent. She had always been that way. He just never took the time to see it. I thought you wanted a simple life. Claire looked at him. I did, but a simple life doesn't mean a small life. Ethan lowered his eyes. I understand that now. She looked out the window. Do you? He was quiet, because he knew he couldn't answer that question with words. Not anymore. I spent years thinking I was the person carrying our relationship. Ethan looked at her. But I was wrong. You were the one carrying us. I was just too focused on myself to see it. Claire felt a strange feeling hearing those words. Not happiness, not satisfaction, just acceptance. Because there was a time when she desperately wanted Ethan to understand. She wanted him to admit that he hurt her. She wanted him to finally see her. But now that he did, she realized something. She no longer needed his approval. I'm sorry, Ethan said. This time his voice was different. Not defensive. Not desperate. Just honest. I am sorry for what I did. I am sorry for making you feel like you weren't enough. I am sorry for making you question yourself. Claire looked at him. I believe that you're sorry. Ethan looked surprised. But being sorry doesn't change what happened. He nodded slowly. I know. Trust doesn't come back because someone says the right words. It comes back because someone changes their actions. Ethan looked at her. I know I don't deserve another chance. Claire didn't respond because she knew that was true. But she also knew something else. She didn't want to spend her life holding on to anger. Forgiving someone didn't mean forgetting. It didn't mean accepting the same pain again. It simply meant refusing to let the pain control her future. I hope you become a better person, Ethan. He looked at her. But not because I come back. Because you need to become that person for yourself. That sentence stayed with him because it was the first time Claire wasn't asking him to change for their relationship. She was asking him to change for his own life. A few weeks later, Ethan made a difficult decision. He stepped away from Miller Capital Ventures. Everyone was surprised. Some people thought he was giving up, but Ethan knew the truth. He wasn't giving up. He was finally admitting that the person he became wasn't the person he wanted to be. He started over. No huge office, no expensive image, no need to impress anyone. He created a small consulting company. He worked with young entrepreneurs. He helped people who reminded him of his younger self. People with dreams, people who needed someone to believe in them. And every time he helped someone, he remembered Claire, because she was the person who believed in him before he had anything. Meanwhile, Claire continued building her own future. She became more involved with Carter Technologies. She traveled for business. She worked on new projects. She spent more time with friends. She learned things she had forgotten, how to enjoy a quiet morning, how to make decisions without asking anyone's permission, how to be happy without needing someone else beside her. And something unexpected happened. She started enjoying her own company. For years, she thought being alone meant something was missing, but she finally understood. Being alone and being lonely were two different things. Loneliness was feeling unseen, and for the first time in years, she felt seen by herself. Almost a year after their divorce, Claire received a message from Ethan. It was simple. Can we talk? She looked at the message for a long time. A year ago, she would have felt nervous. She would have wondered what he wanted. She would have hoped it meant they could fix everything. But now she felt calm. She replied, "Okay." They met at a small park near the same city where everything began. Ethan looked different, not because of his clothes, not because of his appearance, because something about him had changed. He seemed peaceful. "I want to thank you," he said. Claire looked confused. "For what?" "For leaving." She didn't expect that answer. Ethan smiled sadly. "Before you left, I thought losing you would destroy my life. But after you left, I realized losing you was what forced me to face myself." Claire stayed quiet. "I spent years chasing success because I thought success would make me valuable. But you loved me when I had nothing. You saw me before the world saw me." He looked at her, "And I failed to do the same for you." For the first time, Claire saw real regret in his eyes. Not regret because he lost a successful woman. Not regret because he lost a comfortable life. Regret because he hurt someone who truly loved him. And that difference mattered. Ethan looked at Claire for a long time. The woman sitting in front of him was the same woman he married, but she was also completely different. Not because she had more money, not because she had a successful company, but because she finally understood her own worth. "I used to think I lost you because of Sophia," Ethan said. Claire didn't answer. "But that's not true. I lost you long before that." He looked down. "I lost you every time I chose work over you. I lost you every time you tried to talk, and I made you feel like your feelings didn't matter. I lost you every time I assumed you would always stay." Claire listened quietly. Because those words were exactly what she wanted to hear a year ago, but now they didn't have the same power over her, and that was when she realized how much she had changed. A year ago, Ethan admitting these things would have made her cry. She would have held his hand. She would have told him everything was okay, but now she could listen without breaking. And that was freedom. "I want you to know something," Ethan said. "I don't expect you to forgive me completely. I don't expect you to come back." Claire looked at him. "Then why are you telling me this?" "Because you deserve to know that I finally understand." He paused. "For years I thought love was about finding someone who supported my dreams. But I never asked myself if I was supporting yours." Claire looked away. "Because that was the truth. She didn't need someone to save her. She needed someone who would walk beside her. And Ethan had spent years standing in front of her, chasing his own future. After that conversation, Claire and Ethan didn't suddenly become a couple again. There was no dramatic reunion. No promise that everything would return to the way it was, because some stories don't work that way. Sometimes love is not about going back. Sometimes love is about learning how to become better people. Months passed. Claire continued growing her company. She became more involved in major decisions. She traveled around the country for business meetings. She built new relationships. She created new goals. And for the first time in years, her life was not waiting for someone else to begin. She was already living it. Ethan continued rebuilding his life too. His new company was small, nothing compared to what he had before. But he was happier. He no longer cared about looking successful. He cared about doing meaningful work. He started mentoring young entrepreneurs. He helped people who reminded him of himself years ago, young people with big dreams and no guarantees. One day, one of his employees asked him, "Why do you spend so much time helping people you barely know?" Ethan smiled, because he thought about Claire. And he answered, "Because someone once believed in me before I had anything." The employee asked, "Who?" Ethan looked out the window and quietly said, "Someone I should have appreciated more." A year after their divorce, Claire received an invitation. It was for a charity event. She almost ignored it, but then she saw the organizer's name, Ethan Miller. She hesitated, not because she still had feelings, but because she wondered who he had become. That evening she went. The event was simple. No huge advertisements, no people trying to impress each other, just a group of people supporting young entrepreneurs. Claire stood near the entrance, watching everyone. Then she saw Ethan. He was talking to a young man who looked nervous. The old Ethan would have given advice. The new Ethan listened first. That small difference surprised her, because real change is not about what someone says. It is about what they do when nobody is watching. Later that night, Ethan noticed her. For a moment, they just looked at each other. Then he smiled. "Hi, Claire." "Hi, Ethan." It was strange, because once upon a time hearing his voice could change her entire mood. Now, it was just a greeting, a conversation between two people who had shared a chapter of their lives. "How have you been?" he asked. "Good," she smiled. "Really good." And she meant it. Ethan nodded. "I can tell." Claire looked at him. "What do you mean?" "You look happy," she smiled. "I am." And for some reason that answer made him happy too. Because the old Ethan would have wanted her happiness to come from him. The new Ethan understood something different. Someone you love doesn't have to belong to you for you to be happy for them. They talked for a while. About work, about life, about the things they missed. But they didn't talk about fixing the past. Because both of them knew the past couldn't be fixed. It could only be accepted before leaving. Ethan stopped her. "Claire." She turned around. "Yes? I don't know what happens in the future, but I want you to know meeting you was the best thing that ever happened to me." Claire smiled. "Even though it ended?" Ethan nodded. "Even because it ended." She looked at him. And in that moment she understood something. Some people come into your life to stay forever. Some people come into your life to teach you something. Ethan was both. He was the person who showed her what love could feel like, and he was also the person who taught her never to lose herself again. Years later, when people asked Claire if she regretted loving Ethan, she always gave the same answer. "No, because that love gave me some of my happiest memories, but losing that love gave me myself back," and that was the lesson she carried with her. Love should make you feel stronger, not smaller. The right person will never ask you to hide your dreams. The right person will never make you question your value. And the right relationship is not about one person completing another. It is about two complete people choosing to walk together. Claire once thought the day Ethan left her at the airport was the day her life ended. But years later she realized something. That wasn't the day she lost everything. That was the day she finally found herself. And sometimes the ending you fear the most is actually the beginning of the life you were meant to have. This is the part where I truly understood that some endings are not meant to be painful. They are meant to set you free. After everything that happened with Ethan, I thought I would spend the rest of my life being angry. I thought betrayal would become something I carried forever. But slowly I realized something. Holding on to anger doesn't punish the person who hurt you. It only keeps you connected to them, and I didn't want Ethan to have that kind of power over my life anymore. I wanted to wake up every morning without thinking about what he did, without wondering why I wasn't enough, without replaying every conversation in my mind. I wanted to live, and for the first time I did. 2 years after the airport incident, my life looked completely different. Carter Technologies had expanded into new markets. Our team had grown. The company I once built with nothing had become something much bigger than I imagined. But the biggest change wasn't my career. It was me. I was no longer afraid of being alone. I was no longer afraid of starting over. I was no longer afraid of losing people who didn't know how to value me. Because I finally understood something, losing someone who doesn't appreciate you is not a loss. Sometimes it is the moment you get yourself back. One afternoon, I received a message from Ethan. It was unexpected. We hadn't spoken in months. The message was simple. "I hope you're doing well." I looked at the screen for a few seconds, then I smiled, not because I missed him, not because I wanted him back, but because I realized something. A year ago, that message would have changed my entire day. Now, it was just a message. A reminder of someone who was once important in my life. I replied, "I am. I hope you are too." A few minutes later, he responded, "I am," and that was it. No emotional conversation, no painful memories, no trying to reopen the past. Just two people who had finally accepted what happened. A few months later, I saw Ethan again at a business event. He was speaking to a group of young entrepreneurs. I stood in the corner and watched him. The old Ethan would have been trying to impress everyone. He would have talked about achievements, numbers, success, but this Ethan was different. He was talking about mistakes, failure, learning. He told the young entrepreneurs, "Sometimes the biggest mistake you can make is believing your success matters more than the people around you." I stood there quietly, because I knew exactly what he meant. After his speech, he saw me. He walked over. "Claire, hi Ethan." He smiled. "You heard that?" I nodded. "Yes." He looked a little embarrassed. "I wish I understood those things earlier." I looked at him. Maybe you weren't ready to understand them earlier? He smiled sadly. Maybe. We stood there for a moment. Two people who once thought they couldn't live without each other, now standing peacefully without needing anything. I'm happy for you, Ethan said. I looked at him. Thank you. I mean it. I know. And I did know, because for the first time I believed him. Not because I trusted him like before, but because I no longer needed anything from him. That was the difference. When you stop needing someone to validate your pain, you finally become free. Before leaving, Ethan said something I never expected. Claire? Yes? I hope you find someone who sees you the way I should have. I smiled. I hope you find someone too. And that was the last time we talked about us, not because we hated each other, not because the memories disappeared, but because sometimes two people can appreciate what they had and still understand that they are not meant to return. Looking back now, people often ask me if I regret those 7 years. My answer is always the same. No. Because those years taught me something important. I learned how deeply I could love. I learned how much I could sacrifice, but most importantly, I learned where the line was. The line between loving someone and losing yourself, the line between supporting someone and disappearing for them, the line between patience and accepting pain. I used to think a perfect relationship meant finding someone who would never leave. Now I believe something different. A healthy relationship is not built on fear. It is built on two people who choose each other every day. Not because they need each other, because they respect each other, because they see each other, because they make each other better. The day Ethan left me at the airport felt like the worst day of my life. I thought my future had disappeared. I thought 7 years of love had become meaningless. But now I know the truth. That day wasn't the end of my story. It was the moment my story finally became mine. Because sometimes life takes away the person you thought you couldn't live without, only to show you that you were stronger than you ever imagined. And sometimes the person who breaks your heart accidentally becomes the reason you finally learn how to protect it. I'm Claire Wilson, and this is the story of how I lost the person I loved, but finally found the person I had forgotten myself. The first time I walked into my new apartment after leaving Ethan, I stood in the empty living room for almost an hour. There was no furniture, no decorations, no memories attached to the walls, and strangely I felt relieved, because for the first time in years every corner of a place belonged only to me. I could choose the color of the walls. I could choose the furniture. I could choose what kind of life I wanted to create. Nobody was waiting for me to adjust. Nobody was asking me to compromise. Nobody was making me feel like my dreams were too big. It was just me, and I realized something that surprised me. I didn't miss the old apartment. I missed the person I was before I disappeared inside that marriage. The woman who laughed loudly. The woman who chased impossible ideas. The woman who believed she could build something meaningful. That woman wasn't gone. She was just waiting for me to come back. Over the next few months, I rebuilt my life slowly, not dramatically, not like the movies. There was no moment where everything suddenly became perfect. Healing doesn't work that way. Some mornings were still difficult. Some nights I still thought about Ethan. Some memories still hurt. But the difference was, I didn't let those feelings control me anymore. I learned how to sit with my emotions without letting them destroy me. I learned how to enjoy my own company. I learned how to trust myself again. And that was something I never expected before. I thought losing Ethan meant losing my future. But I was wrong. I was losing a future I had built around someone else. And I was finally creating one that belonged to me. At Carter Technologies, I became more involved every day. I started joining important meetings. I helped make decisions. I worked with young employees who reminded me of myself years ago. People who had ideas but were afraid nobody would believe in them. Whenever I saw someone doubting themselves, I remembered the old Claire, the woman who once had a dream but almost gave it away, so I made sure nobody on my team felt invisible, because I knew exactly how painful it was to feel unseen. One afternoon, a young employee named Emily came into my office. She looked nervous. "Claire, can I ask you something?" I smiled, of course. She sat down. "I've been thinking about quitting. I was surprised." "Why?" She looked down. "I don't think I'm good enough." I stayed quiet for a moment, because I knew those words. I had said them to myself many times. Then I asked her, "Who made you believe that?" She didn't answer. "Because sometimes the hardest question is the one that forces you to look inside," I told her. "Emily, don't make the mistake of judging your future based on your current situation. You are still learning. You are still growing. You don't have to be perfect to deserve a chance." She looked at me, and then she smiled. After she left, I sat alone in my office. And I realized something. The pain I experienced had become a lesson I could give to someone else. Maybe that was the reason it happened. Not because I deserved to be hurt, but because I could decide what came after the hurt. A few months later, something unexpected happened. I received an invitation to speak at a women's leadership conference. The topic was, Finding Yourself After Losing Everything. When I saw the title, I almost laughed, because 2 years earlier I would never have imagined myself speaking about strength. I didn't feel strong when Ethan left. I felt broken. I felt lost. I felt like the person I trusted most had taken away my future. But standing on that stage, looking at hundreds of women in the audience, I understood something. Strength doesn't mean you never fall. Strength means you learn how to stand again. I told them my story, not every detail, not Ethan's name, not the betrayal, just the lesson. I told them about the moment I realized I had spent years trying to be enough for someone else. And I forgot that I was already enough. After the speech, many women came to talk to me. Some shared their own stories, some were going through divorces, some were rebuilding their careers, some were trying to find themselves after years of putting everyone else first, and every person had one thing in common. They weren't looking for someone to save them. They were looking for permission to save themselves. That night, I went back to my hotel room. I looked at the city lights outside the window, and I thought about the woman I used to be, the woman standing at the airport, the woman holding 2 tickets, the woman who thought her life was ending. I wished I could go back and tell her something. I would tell her, "You don't know it yet, but this pain will become the beginning of your freedom. You don't know it yet, but you will laugh again. You don't know it yet, but one day you will be grateful you walked away. Because sometimes the hardest goodbye is the one that saves you, and sometimes the person you lose is the person who was preventing you from becoming who you were meant to be." A few years ago, I thought happiness meant having someone beside me. I thought happiness was sharing every moment with another person. I thought happiness was waking up next to someone, planning a future together, and knowing there was someone who would never leave. But after everything that happened, I learned something different. Happiness is not about finding someone who completes you. It is about becoming someone you are proud of. Because when you don't know your own value, you will always be afraid of losing people. You will accept things you shouldn't accept. You will stay in places where you are no longer respected. You will keep trying to prove that you are worthy of love. And that was exactly what I did. For years, I thought loving Ethan meant being patient. I thought supporting him meant putting my own dreams aside. I thought marriage meant sacrificing parts of yourself for another person, but I was wrong. Real love should never require you to disappear. The right person will not ask you to become smaller so they can feel bigger. They will stand beside you. They will celebrate your success. They will be proud of your dreams. They will choose you not because you need them, but because they want to walk through life with you. After everything, I never hated Ethan. That surprised many people. Some of my friends asked me, "How can you forgive someone who hurt you like that?" The truth is, I didn't forgive him because what he did was okay. It wasn't I forgave him because I didn't want his mistake to control my future. I didn't want to spend the rest of my life carrying anger. I wanted peace. And peace came when I finally accepted something. Ethan was not the person who destroyed my life. He was the person who showed me that I needed to rebuild it. Before him, I was Claire. After him, I became Claire again. But this time stronger, more confident, more aware of my own worth. A year later, I was invited to speak at another business conference. This time, the topic was about building companies and overcoming failure. When I stood on that stage, I looked at the audience and remembered the girl I used to be. The girl who started a company with no money. The girl who believed impossible things could happen. The girl who once had dreams bigger than herself. That girl was still there. She had never disappeared. She was just waiting for me to come back. After the speech, a young woman approached me. She looked nervous. "Can I ask you something?" I smiled. "Of course." She hesitated. "How do you know when it's time to leave something behind?" I knew exactly what she was asking. Maybe it wasn't about a relationship. Maybe it was about a job, a dream, a situation where she no longer felt valued. I thought about my own experience. Then I answered, "When staying somewhere requires you to lose yourself, it's probably time to choose yourself." She looked at me quietly, then she smiled, and I knew she understood. That night, I walked alone through the city. The same streets where I once cried after leaving the airport. The same city where I thought my life was ending, but everything looked different because the city hadn't changed. I had. I stopped at a coffee shop, not the same one where I met Ethan. A different one, a new place, a new memory. I sat by the window and watched people walking outside, couples holding hands, friends laughing, people chasing their dreams, and I smiled, because I finally understood something. My story was never about Ethan leaving me. It was about me finding myself after he left. Sometimes we spend years trying to hold on to something because we are afraid of what happens when we let go, but sometimes letting go is exactly what gives us the space to grow. The day Ethan walked away from me at the airport, I thought he was taking my future away, but he wasn't. He was accidentally giving me the chance to create a better one. A future where I didn't have to beg someone to love me. A future where I didn't have to hide my dreams. A future where I finally knew my own worth. And if someone asked me today whether I would go back and change what happened, I would say no, because every painful moment taught me something. Every disappointment made me stronger. Every ending opened a new door. Ethan was a chapter of my life, a meaningful chapter, a painful chapter, a chapter I will always remember. But he was never the whole story, because the most important love story I ever had was the one where I finally learned how to love myself. Years later, when I looked back at everything that happened, I realized something. The person I became was not created by the perfect moments in my life. She was created by the difficult ones. The nights I cried alone, the moments when I questioned my own worth, the day I walked away from the airport with a broken heart. Those were the moments that forced me to discover who I really was. And maybe that was the biggest lesson of my life. Sometimes life removes something from you because you have outgrown the version of yourself that needed it. I used to believe losing Ethan meant losing my chance at happiness, but happiness was never something he gave me. It was something I had to find inside myself. A few years after everything happened, I received a handwritten letter. It was from Ethan. Not an email. Not a text message. A real letter. I held it in my hands for a long time before opening it. Inside, there were only a few pages. He didn't ask me to come back. He didn't ask for another chance. He simply wrote about what he had learned. He wrote, "Claire, I spent many years thinking success meant having everything I wanted, but losing you taught me that having everything means nothing if you lose the people who truly matter. I hope you know that I am grateful for the time we shared. You were the person who believed in me before anyone else did, and I will always regret that I didn't understand your value when I had the chance." I read that letter quietly, and surprisingly, I didn't feel sadness. I didn't feel anger. I felt peace. Because there was a time when I wanted Ethan to understand everything. I wanted him to realize what he lost. I wanted him to feel the same pain I felt, but eventually I stopped needing that. Because my healing was no longer dependent on his regret. That was when I knew I was truly free. I kept the letter. Not because I wanted to hold on to the past, but because it reminded me of how far I had come. The woman who received that letter was not the same woman standing at the airport years earlier. That woman was afraid of being abandoned. This woman knew she would always have herself, and that changed everything. Today, when I look at my life, I don't see a failed marriage. I don't see a betrayal. I don't see the person who walked away from me. I see a journey that taught me the difference between love and losing myself, a journey that taught me the importance of choosing myself, a journey that showed me that sometimes the person you think is breaking your heart is actually opening the door to a life you were too afraid to create. If you are listening to my story right now and you feel like you are losing someone you love, I want you to remember something. Someone leaving does not mean you are not enough. Someone choosing someone else does not mean you are less valuable. Sometimes people leave because they are not capable of appreciating what they have. And sometimes the biggest act of love is not fighting harder. Sometimes it is finally choosing yourself. Because the right people will never make you feel like you have to earn their love. They will never make you question your worth. They will never ask you to sacrifice your identity just to keep them happy. Love should feel like freedom, not fear. Support, not exhaustion. Growth, not losing yourself. The day Ethan left me at the airport, I thought my life was over. I thought the future I dreamed about had disappeared, but now I know the truth. That day wasn't the end of my story. It was the first day of the rest of my life. I lost a marriage. I lost a person I thought I would spend forever with. But I gained something much more important. I gained my confidence. I gained my dreams. I gained my voice. I gained myself. And if I had one chance to speak to the woman I was that morning at the airport, I would tell her, don't be afraid. You are not losing your life. You are finding it, because sometimes the goodbye that breaks your heart is the same goodbye that saves your soul, and that was the moment I finally understood. I didn't need someone else to choose me because I had already chosen myself. The end.